All right, well, we talked so much before the podcast, I've actually finished my coffee now. I'm not really sure what to do.
So how do you want to start this? Because I've got feedback to myself, but like...
Kick off with that.
Cool. Do you want to start cheery and then go down and then go up? Or do you want to just like start at the down and just be all up? How do you want to play the mood?
Start your cheery, go down, and then I want to abuse MacroBioBoi.
Welcome back. So, first up, I have forgotten to clarify from our previous live episode. You may have noticed that there was a really badly edited in reference to instant decaf coffee from Aldi, okay?
Delicious.
Do not get the pod coffee that is decaf from Aldi. It is awful. It's got a really bitter aftertaste. Just get the instant decaf. Instant decaf,
I actually
amazing.
did try to look for that at Aldi, and I could not find it, although I'm given the tip that it's got a blue lid, so maybe I'll find it next time. I also like that we're now a consumer reviews podcast as well. Is Aldi paying us for this? You got a side hustle going?
Not sponsored. Cool. That was one point. The second point was on our previous conversation. We discussed ham hand versus sunscreen armpit. And I feel like a few rules in here need to be clarified just from a couple of questions I got.
Is there an official website of ham hand versus sunscreen armpit? Because it's a big internet thing, right? Someone's gamed out all of these rules. There's a very explicit conditions against all of them.
Maybe I should actually look that up, but I'm just playing it off the top of my head here, man. I heard it many, many years ago on the IGN Pubcast.
Right.
Back when I used to listen to video game podcasts. Yeah, that would almost be 9 years ago now. Gosh. So ham hand versus sunscreen armpit. People want to know about the ham hand. Does it feel pain? No, it does not feel pain. You can still touch with it. It's just shaped like a regular hand. It's not like a hock of ham hanging off the end of your arm. It's in the shape of a hand with 5 digits on it. You can feel the touch sensations, but if you like bite a finger off, you can just do that and it won't hurt. You can just feel in general the pressure on where your finger used to be.
It's not bony. Is there bones in it?
No.
There's no bones, but it acts and articulates as if there were bones.
Yes.
Up until you chew it.
Yes.
Okay, so no loss of function other than it's a bit sweaty and gross.
Yeah, it smells like ham. If it gets in a hot environment, it gets all greasy like ham. Those are probably the biggest downsides of it.
And how long is it going to take me to grow back when I eat my finger? How long until I have a finger again?
24 hours.
Ooh, that's a while. Although I don't eat that much ham, I suppose.
And I've got it in my mind that it like grows back kind of like, you know, Wolverine's healing factor. Like it actually does grow back. It's not like 24 hours later, it just pops back into existence.
Right, so
Going,
that's gradual.
Yep.
So you really only want this ham for dinner. Because like, if I had this ham for lunch, I would not be able to type on my keyboard for the afternoon.
That is very true. Oh, you'd just be one-handing it, right?
I feel like that would impact my productivity.
But, you know, the person we talked to about this online did point out they lived in England. They don't have to worry so much about sunscreen like us. So they're like, you know, this could be a pretty handy, handy. There you go.
Stop that. Don't do that. We're not becoming a pun podcast.
Totally unintentional, but there you go. It could be very useful as like an energy boost while doing a marathon or a triathlon or something like that, right?
Yep. And you don't have to have any weight if you eat extra food. It's like built in.
Yes, exactly. Pretty much most of the problems with it being, you know, it gets smelly and greasy and you just don't want to touch people with it. You could probably get around that just by wearing a glove or something over it, I guess. Although then it'd be extra stinky when you took it off at the end of the day. And then with the sunscreen armpit, how does the sunscreen come out? Are you likely to just be walking around and it just oozes out? And in my head, I have it just that, like, you know how people back at primary school used to make the fart noise with their armpits going...
I do. I was one of those people.
Well, that's the motion you have to make to get the sunscreen out. So you just like put your arm in your armpit.
It's pretty active effort. It's not just going to be ruining all your t-shirts all the time.
Yeah, exactly. If you're doing overhead presses in the gym or whatever, it's not going to be squirting out onto the person next to you in the gym.
All right.
That's my silly feedback.
That is silly. I don't think it changes my decision, but it's good to clarify these things. Like you say, in a country where sunscreen is less valuable, that may be more useful to have the ham hand. Particularly, the drawbacks are not as severe as they could have been.
Indeed, indeed. And then more serious feedback, thinking about the decadent society and Chris's interest in procreation. Having kids and, you know, our favourite discussion in the early episodes of Affix around the value of a life and how it's not really that realistic, but also just to take that premise and apply it to having children. If we assume that a human life is worth $10 million, how else are you going to make $10 million value for society? Like even in my working life, my salary probably isn't going to add up to that much, or the median salary, right?
Yeah,
Over a
probably not.
lifetime of working is not going to add up to $10 million added to society. It's just, so by having children, if you run with that valuation of a life, you are bringing that into the world. You just don't get to capture the value. The person who is your child gets to capture most of that value, but you get certainly a fair share of it as a parent.
Sure. Yeah, sure. You've turned all of human ethics into money again, which is, going to win you some enemies on the internet, I'm sure. But it's definitely an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. It was just like, it's not a perspective I personally hold, but it was just an interesting thought that I had while I was out. So Brian Kaplan also alluded to this after I thought of that, which mildly annoyed me. And then reflections on the MacroBioBoi interview.
Yeah, I would have to say, a very good interview. I was deeply worried that, like, when you're trying to turn this into the Diablo 2 podcast and just cut me out entirely, I was already to strike back and tell you that our audience doesn't care about your minutiae of whether you should swapcast this or swapcast that. But I found it extremely enjoyable. I hope our audience listens to it as well. I mean, you talked a lot about the media and about the landscape of what being a Twitch streamer is like. I found it a very, very interesting podcast. And I am pleased and dismayed about how you asked the origin of his name. And I feel like I need to argue with him because he's wrong about the origin of the name. No. I promise you, that guy has made so many Marines and sent them to their deaths in StarCraft that he's just like blocked it out of his mind. He just can't think about the horror of it anymore.
Because I had that like hidden knowledge of he had done some pretty serious studies in microbiology. I suspected that, but I wasn't going to call you out on the episode. I'm just willing to trust your StarCraft some. And then, when I remembered it when we were talking about Twitch handles,
too
that
good
was
an opportunity.
Great.
So yes, too good an opportunity. I cannot believe I'm wrong. Macro is such a StarCraft thing. Bio is such a StarCraft thing. The fact that a Blizzard streamer didn't play a bunch of StarCraft, because Mr. Llama SC started as a StarCraft streamer. It seems so obvious to me that this is the origin story of all Diablo streamers, as they start with StarCraft and get bored and move into Diablo. Blows my mind that was not the case. Anyway, thank you, MacroBioBoi, for coming on the show. It was very enjoyable for me to listen to and let me have a weekend enjoying myself in Melbourne, which was great.
Yeah, it was awesome. He did offer to have another chat with me at some point, so I'm looking forward to that. There's many questions that I would like to talk to him about that aren't Diablo 2 related at all. I think a couple of his allusions at the end there about gender fluidity and making a safe space, as well as just his history. Like, we didn't get into it too deep on the podcast, but I did have a chat with him prior to it. He's from Boston. He studied microbiology. There's quite a pharmaceutical startup scene in Boston, and he has a background in that. I think he could shed some light on it as well. Had a couple of other reflections on my chat with him. First up, I don't know how many people can relate to this, but I've had it happen a couple of times. When I first started talking to him, we had a video chat going, and imagine you're watching your TV and then the TV character looks straight down the camera and starts talking to you. And it's like, hi, Chris.
Sure.
That is just such an unnerving experience. Like, oh my God, my TV's talking to me right now.
How much do you watch him on Twitch? Like, I know you're a Mr. Llama guy. You watch this guy a lot?
I watch him a reasonable amount. Like, I mostly started watching him last year, just when lockdowns first happened. Because, coming from an open office, having no buzz around you whatsoever is kind of weird. As much as I love working in silence now, like at the start of lockdown, that was very different. So I would just honestly get on a Twitch stream, put it on the TV in the lounge room. And he was one of those who I watched a bit.
Yeah, right. Cool.
But yeah, like the camera setup, it was exactly his Twitch stream layout and everything. So it's just like, oh my God, the TV's talking to me.
The TV's literally just talking back at me. I've gone into the twilight zone.
It was
what a fun experience. Hopefully I can interview some of my favorite people one day.
One day. And then the final reflection on the interview I had was, should we start a YouTube channel?
I mean, maybe. Oh, I was talking to someone who I do think would be a listener and enjoy the stuff, but he's like, I just never listen to podcasts. If you started a YouTube channel, I'd be all over it. Even if you just put your podcast on YouTube with a bunch of random clip art, probably watch that.
See, like I've heard CGP Grey talk about it. I've heard Brady Harron talk about it a little bit on just like putting this stuff up on YouTube and it being another avenue. It was a point that Macro made that I found interesting, was just like YouTube is actually a really good place for discovery.
Yeah, another of our friends who's a YouTuber, he's done experiments where he's made a clean account with nothing on it and just put a few of the keywords that he think will work in the title of the account and uploaded one video. And by the end of the week, he's got 10 followers with no content at all.
Wow.
Right? YouTube is good at surfacing these things and seeing if people like it. And then, presumably if people do like it, it can take off and it gets recommended to everyone and really blow up. But yeah, YouTube as a discovery engine. And this is why podcasting is a weird format and why it's still possible that there's a chance for us to get big. And, we are, as I like to say, we're in the top 25% of podcasts, which is pretty awesome. But without that discovery mechanism, it sort of feels like it limits podcasts' growth. So if we can get in before the inflection curve, because I think that Spotify is likely to be the inflection curve, potentially something quite exciting happens in this space.
Could be. I mean, yeah, there was an interesting interview on Jolly Swagman with Andy Lee from Hamish and Andy, where they talked about, how do you get bigger in podcasting and stuff like that. And even Andy Lee was just like, it's all word of mouth. Like, you just got to get it. And I think pushing these other discovery mechanisms is a good way.
It's all word of mouth through our Instagram channel. Yep, that's what we should do. Distribution is just as important as content, I think. Getting in front of people for the first or second time is one of the tricky bits.
Oh, and just one final thing on the MacroBioBoi interview. Just to go back, I know I've already said one final thing, but here's another. Yeah, coming out of the interview with him, my wife did agree that I look like Mr. Lama SC. So, I guess
there you go. Well, if your wife agrees, then yeah, maybe that's why you're so attracted to the scene. That's what brought you in.
Could be. So I know normally at this point we get a bit of feedback through Chris of all the contact points that we've had. We've actually got a really big piece of feedback that we're going to get to in the next half of the episode, just because there's quite a lot to work through here. But for now, last episode, I promised to review Sapiens, and you know what? It's a really hard book to review, so I'm going to keep this relatively punchy. So,
does that mean I have to read the book?
Well, here's the overview of why it's hard to review. First of all, I got this as a paper book, so if you don't actually carry a literal highlighter and text tabs with you and stuff like that, it's really hard to keep notes on a book, especially when you're just like reading it.
Yeah. Physical books are weird. I don't remember the last time I read a physical book.
Yeah, Kindles are just superior.
I've had people gift me physical books. I'm like, that is very nice. And then I would go and buy the Kindle version so that I could read it on my Kindle. And I would put the physical book next to my bed so I'd remember what I was reading.
Yeah, that's one facet of why I struggled. Like, I actually finished it about a week and a half ago, and I've spent the last week going back through and being like, where was roughly that bit that I wanted to highlight when I was reading it at the time? So that's mildly annoying. The second part of why it's hard to review is normally with these kind of books that we're talking about, they have a real point to them. They've got a direction. They've got a message that they want to land. The stagnation, decadence, run your business with purpose. Like, these are the kind of themes that we've touched upon in our different reviews so far. Sapiens itself is kind of just like, here's an anthropological overview of humanity over the last 100,000 years. And I'm going to distill in different chapters a bunch of different little themes, but there's no message overall to the book, I suppose. So I'm going to do my best to touch on a couple of the key themes in here, but it's hard to kind of summarize because it doesn't have a general arrow of direction of here's the message you should take from this book.
Yeah, man, you're going to have to make the arrow of message so that I can take something from this book, because it's the only way I'm going to take anything from this book.
I'll try. So as I mentioned there, the book itself is kind of like an overview of the history of Homo sapiens as a species over the last 100,000 years or so. It does touch on, at the very start of the book, a few of the other Homo species that were around, like Neanderthals or Denisovans and Homo erectus, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And how that kind of played out. And then it goes kind of over time across different revolutions in the way human society worked. So first of all, there was the cognitive revolution around 70,000 years ago, where language seemingly first emerged and people started coordinating and really expanding. Then there was the agricultural revolution. Then there was religion as a kind of revolution in and of itself. Imagined orders is the way that he puts it. So whether it be the rule of law is an imagined order, whether it be a company is an imagined order, like the company Renault is an example that he works to. It's there's no actual thing called the company Renault. It's just a thing that we all believe.
It's all made up. Everything's made up. Every now and then I say this to people, and they sometimes seem to not believe me. I'm like, no, we made it up. We can unmake it up if we want to.
Yeah, and I kind of talk to that. Then there's religion, there's the science revolution, there's capitalism. And it kind of builds its way to the modern day, and then spends the last little bit of the book mostly talking about sort of modern society and how that's going and what he kind of sees as the future there. So in amongst all that, I believe this is very heavily based in anthropological research, as well as a bit of economics and general history, that kind of thing. So really focused on how societies work, how they don't. And probably the key thing that sticks out in the book overall is it does its best to approximate a non-human view of humanity, I guess it would be, to alienate himself from the species to create commentary on it.
All right. Sounds like something you'd be good at.
So there's like just a lot of reference to biological factors about humanity in here that then, because it's saying, well, we just made it all up, it like calls out the cognitive dissonance between here's the actual facts about the world and then here's the imaginary world that we actually all just choose to pretend to live in.
Yeah, I like the imaginary world.
Yeah.
Seems easy to get things done.
It's pretty great. Like he does make a pretty big point in that was one of the big things that enabled us to build cities and like have a community that was beyond that 150 Dunbars number.
Yep, Dunbars number being the number of personal relationships that a human can sustain. It's posited usually to be somewhere between 100 and 200 people, and it does seem to scale quite directly with brain size. So if you look at chimpanzee troops, they're usually in the order of 50 to 80, and if you look at gorilla troops, they're in the order of 20 to 40. I may be getting the numbers here wrong, but that is the number at which you can just make a society run on relationships. It's like, I don't need a law to tell me not to stab Brian because I just kind of like Brian, so I probably won't stab him anyway. Once you get beyond those numbers, even a small village, a village of 500 people, you need some kind of, what did you call them? Imagined order in order to keep that safe, because there are just people who I do not know, cannot keep them in my head because I can't remember my relationship to them, whether they're a cousin or my butcher or whatever. I cannot any longer remember them. So you have to put some kind of imagined order to get people, rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, exactly. So like that imagined order can be things like the Code of Hammurabi and saying, we've got specific people in a specific hierarchy to our society. There's like a higher person, there's a noble, and there's a regular person. And if you kill or maim the regular person's wife, then you owe that person 40,000 shekels or whatever it is. But if you kill the noble's wife, then you have to die yourself. And we also get to kill your wife too. Like, there's like just random things in here. Yeah, it touched on a lot of other things that I have read. So we talked in a previous episode about inequality and like how there was some ruins in like Russia or something like that, where there was a boy and a girl covered in
wolf teeth
dolphin
cloak.
or wolf teeth and stuff like that.
I think it's wolf teeth cloak. Thousands of wolves died to make these ultra showy cloaks.
Yep, so it's got that in there. It's got a bit of overlap with David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where he's talking about how credit came into society and how we sort of trusted each other, but when we were working outside of that Dunbar number or we were working between tribes, actually having pure tokens of money, as it were, so coinage or little bags of powdered silver or that kind of thing, became quite important for people to coordinate commercial transactions.
Yep.
And then, where it ends up getting to is here's those kind of views, here's the outsider view on it. Touched a little bit on the agricultural revolution being, a big fraud, and we sort of ended up trapping ourselves in a Malthusian trap where because we were able to farm, we then had more children and had to farm, basically. So it wasn't us who domesticated wheat domesticated us, as it were.
Right. I mean, there's a lot more wheat now than there was in prehistoric times. So
there really is.
Pretty good out of it.
Yeah, by slipping down that path of farming wheat, what it ended up doing was enabling humanity to, have more children and fall into that Malthusian trap and be stuck farming. We could never go back to being hunter-gatherers after we started farming, even if the life itself was worse.
Yes. Well, I feel like this is a CGP Grey point, that in theory the life of the hunter-gatherer was idyllic, and there is some evidence to suggest that they would only have to work for sort of 2 or 3 hours a day to hunt/gather, and that was sufficient to create enough calories for a person, whereas a farmer did have to do backranking labour for 12 plus hours a day in order to get the yield from their farm. But he corresponds it to chimpanzees, who also only have to hunt or gather for a few hours a day, and then the rest of their time is spent playing social status games and just like picking on each other and being mean to each other and trying to climb the social hierarchy.
So it's not really that much less stressful at all.
Yeah, I wonder what we do today. Thank God we're past all of that.
So that's kind of summing up the first two parts. And then as it progresses, it gets into this general theory of what really unlocked the power of humanity over the last 500 years or so, I'd say, which was the coming together of empire building, of capitalism, and of science. And this also ties to a point that I made a couple of weeks ago. The Western ideal and how it emerged of science, as posited in this book, is just so incredibly weird because it was very distant from the religious undertones and the imagined orders that had been sustaining societies across the world up to that point.
Okay.
So Buddhism, Christianity, so on and so forth, those different religious orders were effectively saying, we have the answers for you, and if we don't have the answer, it doesn't matter. What matters is what comes after you die, or how you can best persuade the gods to give you rain and that kind of stuff. And if you come to us with a question, it's like, well, no, we don't know the answer. You don't worry about that. What you should be worrying about is how you should be worshipping God right now. And the break from that tradition to actually say, yeah, I don't know why that is. You know what? If we figured out why that is, that might make us actually more powerful in the tangible world rather than spending all this energy in the spiritual world. Was just a really big breakthrough.
Google it. Did they think of doing that?
How old's Google? About 1,000 years, I think.
Okay. Is it 1,000 years? Feels old and big. Yeah, interesting. It reminds me of the Progress Studies blog that I've rediscovered recently of like, why didn't we have progress prior to 500 years ago maybe? And even then, not very much progress. There's a great article, which I'll definitely put in the show notes, of like, why didn't we invent the bicycle in the 1500s? Like, there was no breakthrough in metallurgy. We had wheels. We could have made a belt or chain to do it. Like, it was all possible, but no one really thought of doing it. No one even thought that things could be better, so there was no real reason to innovate. Yeah, something changed in humanity in the past few hundred years to make us actually want to make the world better.
And the funny thing about that is, like, coming up with other arguments. One of them presented in the book is train technology. Getting trains on a rail was discovered in Britain and America, France, Europe. They all rolled it out super fast. Within 40 years, they had like thousands, hundreds of thousands of kilometers of train tracks across their countries. Within 40 years, basically within 5 years, that technology was shared with China, with India, with Persia, and none of them did anything. Like, they might have had a couple of 100 kilometers of train track.
Wow.
And it was only like the evils of colonialism that actually spread that technology, because they were like, nah, we got it sorted. We don't need to worry about improving our material well-being.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I don't know what to think about it, because I do think this is one of the criticisms of getting older, criticisms or realizations of getting older, is like a lot of the new gadgetry is like, why do you need that? Why do you need a Google Home so you can talk to your house? Or why do you need an automatic washing machine? We just did our dishes. It's not that bad, sort of thing. It's that, like, you sort of realize that you can be happy in life without that much. And I wonder, I don't know, this sort of maybe ties back into decadence and an aging society. The older the society gets, the more that I don't know, call it a realization. Maybe it's accurate. Maybe as I age, and I do feel like as I age, this is what I discovered, that all of these gadgetries and making the physical world better doesn't actually matter that much for your internal happiness or relationships. And so why bother, right? And if the Buddha or if Christ is a core part of your happiness, then it doesn't make any difference, right? Improving the physical world doesn't matter at all, because all that matters is that I love and understand Christ. So I could sort of see that, and I could sort of see us sliding back into that, plausibly, just reflecting back on the decadent society.
Yeah, I mean, like, that was kind of the point I was trying to make when we're saying the power of all these innovations in the last 20 years in the internet is all psychological power. It's informational power, probably is the better way to put it. Like, it is actually flows of information. And
communicative power. I think that this got brought up to me by another listener, that we would potentially not still be friends if I moved 300 kilometers away, right? We would see each other once a year and be like, that Brian, I used to sure enjoy hanging out with him. But now I would still consider you one of my absolute closest friends. And it's only because of the communication technology that did exist in the 50s. We could have had a phone call, but it would have been prohibitively expensive.
Yep. And that technology, while it has some productivity benefits in terms of material outputs in the world, predominantly the benefits are to us as conscious beings and wanting to communicate and be social beings and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, which is good. I think that is good. Maybe we undervalue that when we're talking about the Great Stagnation.
Maybe. I don't know.
Although happiness seems to be deteriorating in at least the US, so I don't know. Maybe knowing too many people is sad for you. Too many Joneses to keep up with.
You've kind of derailed me from my review here, which is totally fine, because this is why we have these conversations.
This is why we have the podcast.
It just feels like this could be another one of those mental traps to block material progress, right? Is previously the last traps were religious. They were Buddha, they were Christ, they were Muhammad, so on and so forth, saying, no, focus your attention on the spiritual realm that you'll never really understand. And what we're saying now is, no, what we're going to do is trick you into focusing on the communications and the psychological realm.
That you also never really understand.
Exactly. That was my next point. Like, we don't really understand anything about psychology if you look at how...
Replication crisis.
Yeah, replication crisis and everything like that. It's terrible. So to get back to the book, where it kind of gets to is by taking that distant view of humanity, it's really interesting that it calls out both positives and negatives of empire building and colonialism and colonization and that kind of thing. It talks about how much good there was unlocked in the world from Britain taking over India. Like, that is never a thing that I would ever come across. It's like, okay, yep, we actually understood, and by Britain going into India and extracting all this surplus wealth, what they also did was uncover linguistics. That was never a study before. We never thought about studying linguistics. And by going into India, we uncovered that, we have predominantly a shared linguistic heritage coming out of near India with those kind of different studies, as well as, spreading technology and that kind of thing. Now, obviously, it also plays out that there were some terrible outcomes with, literal calamities and millions of people dying.
No one wants to be the person defending colonialism. We don't do that.
But, that's the thing. I never hear the actual arguments of the good coming out of colonialism, and that was, the different thing in this book. It played both sides. It did have some flaws, and one thing that immediately took me out of the book was it talks about the extinction of Aboriginal Tasmanians, which, genocide, I'm not going to argue against that. That was horrible. But I also know that the idea that there are no Tasmanian Aboriginal genes left in humanity at this point in time is just a myth. And it is disrespectful to those who are the descendants to be saying that. So finding those kind of questionable facts in the book did take me out and make me doubt a few things in there.
Right. I mean, this is a nice rationalist thing to do, is just spot check a few of the references and see if they really say what the author says.
Yeah.
Maybe you should do that.
Maybe.
If you do 5 or 10 references and only 3 of them seem to be true, you can make good inferences about the rest of the references in the book and how much you should trust it.
Yeah, that's fair. And then it kind of ladders up into this weird discussion of what should we be prioritizing at the end of the day? What is happiness even? Is our happiness as individuals predetermined by our genetics? Possibly partially. Is it determined by our ability to predict the future? And this is my own little build on it. By the future and rate of change in society being so much greater today than what it was around 2,000 years ago, does that make it more difficult to be happy because it is harder to predict the future? Don't know. Maybe it makes those predictions more satisfying.
Sure.
Yeah, should we genetically engineer people to be happy, all that kind of stuff?
I mean, is happiness the goal? I still debate back and forth on that one, right?
Yep.
I'm surprised that you didn't bring that up, because it feels like you have much stronger goals than pure happiness, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not trying to do this as a dig, much as I could.
That's fine. I have thought that myself, so I wasn't sure how to bring it up. But yes, is happiness the goal? What's the difference between happiness, joy, satisfaction?
Purpose.
Yeah, being purpose-driven. There was an interesting interview between Steve Levitt and Angela Duckworth recently on the Freakonomics podcast. As much as some people doubt her work, just discussing having an overall level 1 goal that you're working towards, and that can be really a good purpose to have in life and really satisfying and make you happier and that kind of thing. But when you've got conflicting level 2 goals, I want to run my family and have a happy family, and that's conflicting with my goal of, I don't know, making the world a better place and teaching children or whatever.
Oh, man, my goal's just to own a Porsche.
Yeah.
Why are your goals so lofty?
I'm not saying these are my goals.
Oh, okay, phew.
But when those goals come into conflict, that is one of the biggest drivers for unhappiness. So how do you structure your life to minimize those goals coming into conflict at the same time? Do you structure to have certain family time versus having certain purpose-driven time? Do you sacrifice having a family at all? I don't know about that stuff. That's not really my belief.
Steve Jobs did it.
Indeed. I don't know that he's my role model.
Yeah, probably not.
And then it kind of looks forward in the book and sort of looks at, okay, well, what could happen next? Is there going to be gene editing? Are we going to integrate with, having cyborg parts and be out of Deus Ex, which that sounds pretty cool to me. Transhumanism.
Sunglasses that pop out of the side of your eyes.
Exactly. Will we revive a bunch of species that went extinct? All that kind of stuff. So there's some interesting stuff in here. I think overall, I'm going to say the book was pretty good. I am also going to say at the same time, it took me 4 years to get around to forcing myself to finish reading this book. So
right.
Take it as it were.
Okay, I'm probably not going to read that book. Sorry, just to jump back, gene editing and happiness. Man, there's a question that I don't know the answer to. If you could gene edit your child to be at a top 1 percentile level of happiness for their life, would you do that? Maybe you should. I don't know. I don't know whether you should do that or not.
Would I do that? Probably, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Messing with people's emotions is a really touchy subject to me.
Well, this is a thing that we have discussed before, Chris. You tend to have a more happy outlook on life generally than me. Just straight up.
Yes.
That's pretty easy to distinguish. Would I prefer my children to have your outlook on the world versus my dragged down depression, right? And I think I would prefer my children to have your outlook. And if I had the choice, I feel like the right choice is the other way.
I feel like you're probably right. I think I'm just depressed at the moment, so it's hard to see.
Yeah.
But I think you're probably right.
I think there's a lot of motivation behind having that baseline happiness and that kind of thing. I think I see it in Hank Green. It's probably one key person I see it in.
He seems happy. His brother not so. I wonder how the genetics worked out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's Sapiens. I like the book. It's just full of anecdotes. How reliable all they are, I don't know. But at the very least, it'll give you a lot of factoids to talk about at whatever dinner party you go to.
Or on a podcast.
Indeed.
This is the part of the podcast where we get down on our knees and beg you to subscribe, to Patreon us, to email us. We're actually getting a few good emails. Like most of this show is going to be about one of our Patreon's emails, so I'm looking forward to that. We've got a few patrons started to suggest topics, so we've got a few in the back pocket that we can do as we work our way through them. But it would be great to have more patrons. It would be great to have more subscribers. One question from a listener is like, when do you publish? And they're like, this podcast should come out if I'm doing my job every Sunday. So that is when we aim to release. We are a weekly podcast. Will come out every Sunday. If you subscribe to us in your podcast player, all of them should have a subscribe button. That means it will download into your phone every Sunday, ready for you to listen to whenever you listen to the week. So, you don't have to listen to it on Sunday if you don't want to. I know certain people have a day of the week that they go for a walk and listen to the podcast. That's fine. But yeah, we should come out every Sunday. We've got show notes. I just like to remind listeners that I have show notes.
The show notes are really good, listeners. Like, check them out.
I do. I put a lot of work into it. Brian puts a lot of work into editing, so I just feel obliged to put a lot of work into the show notes.
How else would you know that Chris likes the interview with MacroBioBoi? Oh, wait, you'd listen to this episode. But you can also get that in the show notes.
That's how I told Brian initially. Kept it a secret. He was like, so did you think I did good, Chris? I'm like, I'm not going to say. It wasn't until it got downloaded into Brian's podcast that he's like, oh, phew, Chris forgives me. But if he turns this into a Diablo 2 show, I'm not going to be happy.
No, I did promise that if I turn this into a Diablo 2 show, I will actually just make a second Diablo 2 show and we won't junk up your feed, dear listeners, because we appreciate you so much and we don't want to alienate you at all. We use that word a lot on this podcast and it's not something that we don't want to do to people.
Oh, also, I want to rename our audience. I do worry that it's a little bit condescending to give a name to our audience because it's mostly our friends, but I would prefer to just call them Fixers. I reckon Fixers is a cool name for a gang.
The Fixers. Nice.
So that's my proposal.
That just reminds me of the wolf from Pulp Fiction, where he's like a fixer and he's like comes into the place and just...
Yeah, yep. It's just, you got a couple of dead bodies, do you? All right, well, we've dealt with this before.
Oh, fantastic. Please continue to share us with your friends, send us emails, and... yeah, we appreciate you so much, folks.
Thanks, audience. Right, we got a very long and very insightful email from one of our Patreons, which I really appreciate. It's nice when people engage in these conversations and bring up points that we hadn't thought before. And so after the discussion of Rostuthat and the decadent society and my fears that Western society will go away and that would be a terrible thing, and then I cried a bunch, etc., he brings up the point, to what extent do we have an obligation to future generations? And I actually did a little bit of a Google on this, not as much as I would like, as you'll find out later in this episode, but this is called population ethics. So this is the ethics related to populations that do not yet exist, and how should we treat those future unborn generations from an ethical perspective? So this comes into play, largely climate change would be where you'd hear about it, that, we are going to destroy the planet for our grandchildren, and population ethics is how to think about it. And it's always been one of the most complicated facets of ethics to me, because it's easy to say they don't exist, so we don't think about them. But when you bring up specific examples, it is less clear. So, the question is, do we have an obligation to continue / replace our current culture? And he plans on reproducing himself, but he doesn't feel like the lineage of Western culture is the reason that he does that. He's doing that for his own reasons because he would enjoy being a father and wants to have his own family. He doesn't do that for the propagation of Western culture. And I am possibly not on this page. I think that we do have more of an obligation to our descendants. I don't know. This is where I find it really difficult and why I enjoy having a podcast where I can talk about these things quite seriously with you, because I'm really not sure where my brain goes. I think that Western culture gives a remarkable, I think it gives me a remarkable level of happiness. There's actually debates about whether it gives the overall Western culture a remarkable level of happiness. There do seem to be a lot of depressed people in Western culture, but certainly we have a very high standard of living for a large part. We've cured a lot of illnesses. We mostly have roofs over our head. We have hot and cold running water. There is a lot to like about our modern Western culture. And if that were to be replaced with a totalitarian culture or a theocracy or something, I do think that that would be worse overall for humanity, even if it doesn't happen for hundreds of years. I think that we have an obligation to prevent that where we can.
I think you're right. There was a lot to this particular email, and we're only talking about the first paragraph right now. This was a key question that occurred to me a few years ago when I was trying to pick out my own reasoning on the benefits for free trade and why I should be happy about people in China escaping poverty when there may be downsides to the local economy in Australia, for example. So, we don't make TVs here anymore. We just import them all from China and Japan, that kind of thing. And at the time I was like, this is just objectively good. more people are coming out of poverty, they're getting rewards, they are not having to suffer as much anymore. But some people who are closer to me culturally are suffering a little bit more than they used to. Now, they're not suffering as much at an overall level, of course. Like, it's not a one-for-one trade, and I felt pretty happy about that. But facing into the conversations with different people online around their support for pushing it back against free trade and a more nationalistic view, I really wanted to unpick why I should care more about the average Australian than I should care about the average human, right? Or the average person in China.
Yep.
And what you kind of get to there is a little bit of it. I wish I'd read more on population ethics, to be honest. Where I ended up getting to is kind of tied to that conversation where we were being dangerously close to being original a few weeks ago.
No, we're not going to do that again, are we?
About genetics and memetics and the distance that you have between people. And like inherently, how much you will like people in your own life who are closer to you memetically, right? So if I have a lot of overlap with Chris because we both used to watch Strong Bad as we were growing up as teenagers, and, you know, we're both kind of nerdy guys. I'm a bit more of a weeb than he is, but, you know, that's all right.
No, it's not. I only learned this recently, and I'm really not sure that it is. I'm yet to endorse this.
But yeah, like, we have a lot of background overlap that I would never have with someone in China, right? And if I look at that in the abstract, if I were to just meet Chris for the first time today, or if, you know, I've even met some of Chris's friends who had the same background, and I became faster friends with them than I ever would with someone who had none of that overlap, even in Australia. And because I like that kind of person more, if I extrapolate that out, that's going to give me a preference towards Australians generally, because they're going to have more experiential overlaps with me as a person because, you know, we were all raised in Australia. We have a lot of cultural things, you know, a fair go, have a crack at stuff. Holden Utes, yes, of course, Holden Utes. Predominantly, we went through the same schooling systems, you know, 6 years of primary school, go through to high school at a certain level, have those kind of bonding experiences. And that gives me a really good baseline to become friends with anyone in Australia that I just wouldn't have with someone outside of my society. And it's kind of that general preference that I would also share, to a degree, more with my children than I still would with someone in Africa, right? Or someone in China, or someone in Vietnam. Now, by traveling to those places, that gives me a little bit more shared overlap with them, and I'm less likely to privilege the people who are closer to me now because I have that extra bit of overlap. But that's kind of how I approach the problem in the abstract, was go, okay, in general, I'm more likely to become friends with an Australian because of those shared interests than I am to become friends with someone over there. And generally, as a human, I want to treat my friends better than I want to treat
that's
complete strangers.
Directly saying that, you know, you really like your culture because you are a part of it and a product of it and a perpetuator of it, and therefore you do want to perpetuate that culture down the line over and above other cultures. I'm not actually sure it's a very rational decision, but it's a very human decision.
Yeah.
And I think I share it. I think I share it instinctually, right? And I think we all do.
Yep.
Sort of, we like our own culture. We find ourselves happy in it and we want more of it. And certainly that is how I feel about my culture. And I've traveled a bit and I've experienced other cultures, and I still like the Australian culture. This is where I want to live. These are the people that I like, and I think that this is a good thing for the world. So given the option, this is what I would like to propagate.
And I think, that's a fairly good summary of it. I guess where the challenge becomes is when you're looking down further generations, culturally, they're going to become more and more distant from you, right? In 200, 300 years, who knows what that's going to look like? And should I really care about them as much? Well, Tyler Cowen makes a pretty good argument for why you should in Stubborn Attachments. But, when you turn everything into math, sometimes it doesn't feel the most human, I suppose, and the turning it into common sense ethics is difficult.
Yeah, I mean, common sense ethics is always difficult. Much as Stubborn Attachments really tries to make a solid go of reconciling common sense ethics with economic theory and mathematics, and does an okay job. Yeah, it is tricky to empathize with those hundreds of years in the future, given how much cultural mores have changed in the past 50 years, 60 years. Like, you know, the cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s were pretty huge. So our grandparents prior to that would find us almost unrecognizable today.
Yep. So, I don't know. That's the general argument I've come into being in my own head, struggling with this question for the last half a decade. Maybe that'll help you figure out your own path forward, dear listener. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, like, is that good?
Yeah.
Is this listener correct, right? I mean, I can admit that this is why I think all of these things. If you get down to base level utilitarian ethics, which is, again, what I think is correct ethics, even if virtue ethics are an easier way to live your life and what I will aspire to day to day, are we just trapped in this mind state that is ultimately going to end up in harm for the world? Like if China had a provably better system of government, and there's a lot of competition between the systems of government in the West and China at the moment.
Yep.
But if it actually generated greater human welfare in the future at the expense of destroying Western civilization because we're so decadent and we collapse in on ourselves, is that a bad thing for humanity? If everyone in 300 years' time is descended from the Chinese philosophical and governmental system, but are all much happier than us, is that a bad thing?
If I were to take the alien eye view, potentially. If I were to take my view as a human being, yeah, I think that's bad.
Sure, I agree. I mean, my instinct is that is bad, but I think it's hard to argue from any perspective other than I like my own culture and I want more of it, please.
Well, I like, as much as you may not believe this, Chris, I kind of like myself. And
I do not believe this.
And I kind of want a part of myself, being the culture that I live in, to go on, to replicate.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very natural urge.
I think that is a very natural urge. I'm just not sure that it is a good urge if you really get down to the nuts and bolts economics of it. Like you say, translating that to common sense ethics is where things break down. And I will tend to side with common sense ethics. I think deeply and clearly about these things, and I come to conclusions that my gut doesn't like, and I'm like, well, never mind then. Go with my gut.
Yep, nuts to that. Yeah.
But
there's still an argument to say if that totalitarian state was going to be what it took for humanity to fend off an asteroid that was going to wipe out all of life on Earth, would I prefer that to the ongoing existence of Western society? Yeah, I'd prefer that. Because at the end of the day, as different as that totalitarian state would be to what I have culturally currently, it's still humanity. And humanity is a big part of who I am.
Humans are humans everywhere. I mean, even those culturally different with them, they're still just people, right? When you
Exactly.
get to know them, they are just people. They can have different cultural things. Some of them like to tip, which is just weird and bizarre, but they're still just people.
Exactly. So it's a big question. It's one that I will continue to struggle with over time. But that's kind of where I'm working towards on it.
Absolutely. So, paragraph 2 of this 3-paragraph email, which is it's really good. I'm like, this is a well thought out email. I really, really appreciate it because I didn't have anything to talk about on this podcast, and now I've got a freebie. Talks about the level of wealth and childbirth. So we made the point that A, wealth of society is increasing, and B, birth rate is decreasing. And so one of the points made is like it does depend on who holds that wealth, and certainly there is a trend in Western society for the younger generation to have less and less as a percentage of the total wealth. There's a lot of graphs about millennials and how poor they are compared to their parents. So I do want to briefly mention that as the overall wealth of society increases, this is sort of what you expect. In each of the world wars, we sort of destroyed everything and started with nothing. So the wealth was obviously much more spread out for boomers because there wasn't much wealth. So by being a kid and having not much, you still had a reasonable percentage of stuff because there's just not much. Now that we haven't blown everything up for the past 80 years or so, there's a lot more stuff. So it sort of makes sense that the people who are older and have been collecting stuff for 60 years have a bunch more stuff than the person who's only been collecting stuff for the past 5 or 10 years because they haven't had it all blown up.
Yep. Oh, totally. This was a point that we made back reviewing the Great Leveler for sure.
Yeah, so I think that this is it's easy to see these graphs of, the percentage of wealth held at age 30 by a millennial versus a boomer and get really depressed about, we're all so poor and society's ruined. But it's just a reflection of how much wealth there is in society and that you may not be poorer at an absolute level than your parents, but you are just poorer as a percentage of the amount of wealth out there. And all of that wealth's going to get inherited ultimately.
Yeah.
There's nothing else to do with it.
I think how this plays into having children is difficult. Like Brian Kaplan tries to argue against it a bit in Selfish Reasons to have more kids around, well, actually the cost of having children has decreased a lot these days because you can get cheaper social support or like Amazon's easier to get. IVF is cheaper than ever, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like opportunity cost of getting out of the labor force has increased for most professionals.
That's true. Yeah,
so
that's definitely true.
Maybe that's part of why it doesn't impact the lower classes as much as why it impacts those more educated, which is where we're seeing the biggest push.
Yep, climbing your way forward through the rat race, as it were.
Yep.
It's hard if you take a break, it can set you back more than just the number of years you take out of the workforce because you're then no longer seen as a striver, as a high achiever, so you don't get the opportunities even when you do come back after having kids.
Yeah. It's also... This is like a thing that I don't know how common it is, but it just seems so weird, the lack of multi-generational households in the West. Like Growing up as a kid, I saw a reasonable amount of it, and I've still got some friends who they've got their own kids, but their dad has moved into like a little shack off, like a granny flat, basically. Like this is where the granny flat term came from, people. And it just seems like that is not something that people want to deal with in modern society. I don't know.
No, and that is very common in developing nations. I remember in Thailand that was quite common, that you're really only expected to work for 20 to 30 years of your life, because when you're a kid, your parents take care of you, and when you're over, I don't know, age 50, your kids take care of you, and you just live in one big household, and the grandparents take care of the kids while the working age people work, and you really only work for 20 odd years, and that's your life, because you just all live in the same household, and that's how the generations flow through, and then you take time off to take care of your kids, your grandkids.
Yeah, that is a way of mitigating that opportunity cost of having to go to work and instead of raising kids, basically.
Yeah, and it's a good way to put the elderly to economic use, right? If you want to say that childcare is economically valuable, even if it is unrewarded in a monetary sense, then that is a way to get additional value out of people who can no longer work a traditional job, or who no longer want to work a traditional job.
Yeah, and I know it still happens these days. Like, yeah, sure. Parents palm off the kids to the grandparents at a reasonable rate, but we're just not as well structured to have that kind of thing set up. And maybe
and is that itself a reflection of wealth, right? It used to be, the way you got a home is you inherit your parents' home, right? That's the only way to get a home. And now that we can, like, much as housing is extremely, extremely expensive, you can afford to move out of your home and get a place of your own. And that is encouraged and sort of seen as the default. It's gone backwards a little bit since 2008, but it is still seen as the default that you will move out of your parents' home.
This is not building off the email anymore, but how much of that is just like urbanization? Like a lot of that stuff used to happen, or the way I read it used to happen, was you had mobility to try and get people to go to those more centers of excellence, right? To get to those high productivity
get them
cities
into the
and
cities.
that kind of thing. And it wasn't a locked in outcome as to what city that would be. You might still be better off moving to a regional center and working in agriculture and making a killing being a shearer, right? But similarly, you might make a killing moving to the city and going to Melbourne and becoming a professional, becoming a lawyer or an accountant, or working in a factory, even working in manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, that would possibly be where the shift started to happen, would be in the original Industrial Revolution, where you could just make a lot more money in the cities, so that cities dragged in more and more people.
Yeah, and as that productivity benefit of being in a city has kind of crystallized around these key centres, being in Australia, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, but, I'm not going to talk down Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth. I might talk down Hobart and Darwin, but,
I'll talk down Brisbane. They all have weird accents up there in Queensland.
Yeah, man. Like, you don't need to move. Like, there's very little incentive for me to move from Melbourne to Sydney unless I'm just making it as a social statement to say I'm making myself to be my own human being rather than still just being an extension of my parents.
Yep. Which is a popular thing to do also in the West. I think perhaps less popular in China and the East and non-Western countries generally.
Yep.
There's less of a drive for that, maybe. So, I don't know. There's a lot of money out there. Maybe you're not as poor as you think you are. Well, the next point is...
Sorry, just before we get this, like, one of the questions in this paragraph is, some things to ask are, who is wealthier? And, like, if I just ignore everything else, like, who is wealthier, us in the West with our actual capitalistic measured wealth, or is the real wealth the friends you made along the way?
I mean, I like the friends that I made along the way. I try to hang on to them much more than I try to hang on to my money.
Yeah, so, like, I don't know, prioritizing social connections feels pretty undervalued to me. Maybe you should be figuring that out.
Maybe you should be figuring it out.
And looking forward to having children, you can have a pretty good social connection with your children. This is, again, one of the arguments that Brian Kaplan makes. Imagine yourself at 65 years old. Who are you going to be most connected with then? And would having children who are, in their late 30s at that point in time make your imaginary self a lot happier than not? I don't know.
Yep. Yeah. It's a very good point, because I have a great relationship with my parents particularly, and I think they get a lot of the relationship with me. And, Brian Kaplan's point is that, like, if you have at least a half a dozen children sort of thing, at least two of them won't have moved away, so you've got someone to hang out with on weekends. Like, a bunch of your children are going to move to New York or Sydney or wherever, but some of them might stick around if you have enough. Final point. Universal basic income. And I feel like another listener has made a similar point on money. So this listener inherited a substantial amount of money in their early 20s, mid-20s, I believe. A few $100,000. Certainly not enough to stop working, but enough to suppress worries about how am I going to make it, how am I going to pay this debt off, how am I going to rent a place that is acceptable to me, etc., etc. And so continued to be career-driven, but much more reluctant to sacrifice quality of life, which is a situation I say I find myself in. allowed him to study in China, allowed him to move to Canada on a whim after watching Love, actually. I think that he's always had a dream to live and work overseas, so I'm not sure it was entirely just watched a movie, moved overseas. But the point he makes, and I want to push back on this, is like, I think it supports the Chris and O'Brien notion that if money was less of a stressor, people would have more of a chance to find other ways to contribute to society. And I want to make the point that you going and studying in China, not contributing to society. You uprooting your life and moving to Canada, probably not really contributing to society. I actually wonder whether this ties into decadence, is that we have so much options to just like do this self-actualization, enjoying my life, living my best life. And I do not blame you for doing this, because this is how I want to live my own life, that we no longer create the economic wealth that we could when we were forced to, because if we didn't create that economic wealth, we starved or we froze.
I would still say those decisions are contributing to society. They're just contributing in different ways. And maybe they're not the optimal way that would have happened otherwise, right? Like they might be lower GDP adders, have less to add to GDP than would have been done otherwise. But, you know, going to study in China, you're adding value to the Chinese economy by being there. And also you're adding social value by, you know, spreading your culture around there and learning more about theirs at the same time.
Which, as we established in paragraph 1, is a good thing. You're wrong.
Yep. Similar thing with going to Canada. Like, you're still going there. You're still joining the workforce. You're actually contributing to their GDP. And you just
but are you, by moving to Canada, I imagine that there's a significant reduction in your economic output because of culture shock, just because of the price of the plane ticket, right? Is there any additional GDP to be claimed by this listener working and living in Canada rather than Australia? I feel like they could have had similar or greater productive output in any Western nation, and the fact that they moved set things back and actually produced less. It's a consumption good. And you know,
so I agree with your point there. I guess I just read it slightly differently, which is just like, it's another way to contribute. It's not a better way.
Right, sure. I just feel, I don't know. It depends what you think a real contribution, whether that is just physically improving standards of living or whether this emotional friendship, self-actualization, learning, experiencing is a true contribution. But I do think that that is consumed, not produced by this listener. And I think that that is your prerogative when you are wealthy, that you can consume in the way that best fits your values, and moving internationally is an excellent way to improve your own life and understanding of the world and culture, etc. But I don't think it's production.
I agree with most of the points that you just made there. I just don't think it's only wealthy people are allowed to do that. I think everyone is allowed to pursue those things. It's just bounded by their wealth.
Yes, I agree. And so having a windfall of wealth, albeit in unhappy circumstances, allows you to more easily make that choice where other people don't get that choice to make.
Yes, totally. Cool. So that's kind of the email. I will also just call out in like the second sentence, they managed to recognize that I called out a blog series called The Fremen Mirage from aku.blog, just from me like vaguely referencing it. So there you go. The Fremen Mirage. Fremen is it Freeman or Fremen? I don't know. I always read it as Fremen.
I pronounce it Fremen, but
yeah. It's a reference to the book series Dune by Frank Herbert. They were kind of hard people who lived through hard times and were able to take over the decadent society that they were surrounded by. So keen listening there. Clap, clap.
A+. One of our first Patreons, one of our greatest Patreons. What an excellent email. Thank you very much for giving us content for an entire podcast.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all the feedback you got. It's coffee bet time.
Oh no, oh no, oh no. I don't have one.
Do I like make a challenge Chris bet to be like, how long until we get a YouTube up?
Oh, okay, sure. I mean, I reckon I can get that pretty quick. It's going to impact on the quality of the show notes. There's only so much time I'm willing to spend on this podcast each week. So more time building YouTube channels means less time adding show notes. And speaking of coffee bets, I think you have lost one. So our last thing to add listener engagement and like try to get you guys involved, which I thought would be fun.
Oh yeah,
a big list of coffee bets. It didn't actually go very well. No one was really interested in betting alongside us. So
we got a few people. Come on,
we got a few. My biggest surprise was the one who filled in their name as not Brian was genuinely not Brian. I really just assumed that was Brian trying to help himself win the coffee bet, which, you know, more power to him. That's what I do. But it was not Brian. So we have a total of 8, but it has definitely been much longer than the period of time.
Yeah. So, and I had said 10 all up with an incremental 8. So alas, when Chris and I see each other next week, I will have to pay for a coffee.
It's another coffee. I would like to just show you how... I do think the listeners mostly agree with you, though, so that makes me a little bit sad. I mean, they're probably right. You're probably right. But there are, it's not as far as I thought. 32 people bet alongside you, 26 people bet alongside me. So given that you had already nearly won a few of those coffee bets, that
seems pretty reasonable.
That's pretty reasonable. And
that makes me feel like we're finding the right 50-50 point.
That does feel good. Yeah, that definitely feels good, for sure. We're balancing these coffee bets quite nicely. But I'll leave the quiz up if anyone wants to go back into the show notes and do the quiz. You're more than welcome to, but I don't think we'll make that an ongoing thing. You can just listen to us instead.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to force the bet. It's going to be the YouTube bet. I'm going to say, can Chris get episode 1 and 2 of this podcast up in 2 weeks' time?
2 weeks' time. Do we have to have any viewers of that podcast or no?
It has to be publicly released, but as long as
but do people have had to have watched them?
No.
Okay. All right. I reckon I can do you one better. I reckon I can get at least 3 views.
3 views on top of having them
take
up.
that back. It depends what you define as a view. There's probably a real fast drop-off.
Well, like if it's
I
just the
get 3 people to
YouTube
watch
views,
it all
because
the way
I think they count a view of being like if you've had it up for like a minute 30 or something like that.
I thought it was way less than that. I thought it was a few seconds counted as a view.
I thought it was like Facebook had that to be like even if you scroll past it, it counts it.
Yep. Actually, you may be right on that. All right, 2 weeks, 2 episodes. I mean, I'll take that bet because I feel fairly strongly in control of it, and it's good motivation for me to do things. So I need a bit of that in my life right now.
All right, well, I'm happy to pay our coffee just to keep Chris motivated. That feels like
Hooray.
Good friendship.
Extrinsic motivation, sometimes the most important motivation.
There we go.
I mean, really, the more I think about it, the more I really think that's true. Extrinsic motivation, very important. Hard to keep yourself motivated.
Cool. All right, it's a bet. I look
It's a
forward to
bet.
paying it.
Right, what is the news from Diablo this week?
Well, Diablo, there has not actually been a new run submitted to speedrun.com for Diablo 2 in over a month now. It's disgraceful.
A month? What are they all doing?
Well, I'm pretty sure actually most of the people who normally do this stuff got into the alpha for the remaster, which I talked to MacroBioBoi last week about.
Did you get into the alpha for the remaster? You're a famous Diablo 2 podcaster.
I'm pretty sure my computer actually couldn't run it.
This is the only thing that I have to think of spending our patrons' money on. I was going to buy each of us a copy of Diablo 2. That's all I had.
Well, here's the thing. Like, in my own Diablo segment, I'm taking it on a tangent. Why can't I just rent a GPU to attach to my computer? Like, is that another thing? Is that a service I can go to?
Physically?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It might be, probably in the cities. I would struggle to believe that it existed in the country.
Okay. I mean, obviously, I'm just going to ask for favors. Any listeners, if you're willing to help me out with an eGPU, I'd love it, just for a couple of weeks. Anyway, but what has happened in the last week, this very morning, in fact, was a assassin race between a few of the key names in Diablo speedrunning. It was a hell hardcore assassin race. So if you die, you're gone. And it was between names that I've all talked about before. So Indrek was there, Macalb was there, Ryo Quetzalcoatl was there, Bender Meets Fry was there. All
MacroBioBoi?
No, MacroBioBoi was there.
He was busy talking to you.
Yep, clearly. And the end outcome was that everyone except Bender died. So it was like neck and neck.
Did
Indrek
he
was up
assassinate
there.
them? Is that what's going on here?
Oh, that'd be pretty sneaky. So yeah, they all pushed ahead. I think Macalb died first, and then he actually tried to get a second run up and going and catch up to everyone. No, got taken out.
Really?
Yeah, Ryu again made it to hell, so he would have been about 4 hours in, and his character died. Being hardcore, you're just completely gone. You can't continue on. Same with Indrek. He got up to Act 3 in hell
I
difficulty.
feel like when we played Diablo Resurrected together, it's going to be a very weird experience. We're just not going to play it together because you're talking about getting to hell in 4 hours, and I'm pretty sure 4 weeks would be a good target time for me.
We'll get you there, man. We'll find a good group, and we'll do a hell run. It'll be awesome.
Okay.
So that was the outcome. Bender Meets Fry is the champion of speedrunning on Diablo.run, and he was the champion of this race. Who'd have thought it?
Man's good at Diablo 2. He knows what he's skilled at. Pushes it to the limits. Well played.
Took it to the limit. There we go. That's the news.
Woo!
Cool. That's it. That'll do.
That'll do.